Welcome to our live audience here in San Diego. We're so grateful to have you, and we're so grateful that you could join us today. And I'm especially excited to introduce our special guest today, Dr. Louis Falik. He is Professor Emeritus of Counseling from San Francisco State University. He is a Feuerstein Scholar with the Feuerstein Institute in Jerusalem, and a prolific author on many topics, especially related to psychology and psychotherapy, as well as a co-author of a number of books with the late Professor Reuven Feuerstein on the mediated learning experience, structural cognitive modifiability, and Feuerstein's instrumental enrichment. And in addition to all of those things, Lou has been a longtime friend of Learning for All and a personal mentor for me. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce him today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Louis Falik.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. I feel like I'm coming out. You're the first people that I've been able to deal with in proximity. This last 2 years has been fascinating because we've all learned a lot of ways of interacting with people that we didn't know we had, and the technology makes it possible. But I still have this feeling that face-to-face is something special. So this is the first time. I'm also excited and pleased to be able to present the material to you today that we will experience together. I did a very redacted version of it for a Zoom conference in Italy 2 weeks ago. But this is the first time I'm having the opportunity to really have the time to expand it. You know from Rachel's introduction how deeply committed I am to Learning for All. And right from the very beginning, she said I'm her mentor. Well, the learning relationship is two ways. And so I learned from Rachel, and I learned from the work you're doing. And I remember the first time I was able to sit in on some of the therapy sessions at Learning for All, and how impressed I was at the clinical skills that you guys have. And I'm sure it's a community of interest that you continue to learn. And so I'm pleased to be able to participate in it and contribute to it. And I hope this won't be the last time that I have a chance to work with you and be with you. There's one assumption that has to be made about this presentation, and that is that you have some familiarity with mediated learning experience, with the parameters of mediated learning experience. And if you've been trained in instrumental enrichment, if you've been worked with my dear colleague Todd, I can feel somewhat confident that you have that sense, because I'll be referring to the parameters of MLE. The way to think about this is to consider what I'm going to do with you today as integrative. In other words, you come to this with skills. You come to this with experience. You work with clients. You work with children. You work with the children. You consult with their parents. You work with them. And underneath that work, no matter what the skills are, whether we're talking about techniques of learning to read, it is an interpersonal interaction. And so the integration that I'm hoping for through the work that I've done is to show how we can use what we know about the process of mediated learning experience to enhance the quality of the interpersonal interaction. That's the integration. And this is the 100th year anniversary of the birth of Reuven Feuerstein. And so there are commemorations going on in many parts of the world What I did 2 weeks ago in Italy was part of that. What I'm going to do in Prague in 3 weeks, I'm going to make the same presentation. That's why this is a dress rehearsal for me. Is to bring to a group of Feuerstein practitioners in the Czech Republic this work. And I'm pleased that there's interest in this work, because whatever our practice is, whether we're learning therapists, whether we're psychotherapists, whether we're parent consultants, whether we're the quality of the interpersonal interaction, if it's understood more deeply, and if we can see the contribution, the underlying dynamics of the process of mediated learning experience as they are reflected in our work, we enhance the quality of our work. So that's the underlying, well, actually it's maybe the overarching reason for this. What we'll do today will be in two parts. The first part, I will take you through a conceptual framework. What is it all about? What are some of the key concepts that are present in the interaction? And I'm going to link mediated learning experience, parameters, to what is generally known about the process of developing interpersonal relationships. So here is a little bit of history, so you'll see how this develops. In 1989, I was sitting in Professor Feuerstein's office, and we were talking. It was the end of the day, and he mused. He said, "You know, we've done a lot of development of the concepts of structural cognitive modifiability. We've created good programs to assess and to intervene with the needs of the children and families. But what we haven't done is we haven't really looked at whether the extent to which mediated learning experience extends to therapy, extends to counseling, extends to the interactions." He says, and Lou, I was relatively new with Reuben at that time. He says, "Would you like to write something about it?" And I said, "Sure." He says, "Well, it's a good idea if you write something about it, because then people in the Feuerstein world will know that the implication was, can you write?" So I said, "Sure." And so for the next almost year, I drafted a paper, and I got his feedback. And in 1990, we published a paper that was a kind of a general overview with the hypothesis that mediated learning experience is as relevant to the practice of counseling and psychotherapy as it is to any other practice, particularly in the learning development area. And then that was 1990, and then I was teaching at San Francisco State in the counselor education program. So I began to develop a curriculum to teach it to my students, and I learned something from that. In a master's program in counseling, we would select people who were intuitive, who were creative, who were very interpersonally related, and then we would start teaching them the interviewing skills. And I found in my students that when they started to learn the interviewing skills separate from anything else, they lost their intuitiveness. They just didn't know what to do. They were working so hard on what do I say and when do I say it, and and how will I know that the client is getting it, and so on. And they were really hamstrung. So I developed a curriculum, and I'll show you in the second half of our presentation today. I'm going to give you an opportunity to play with the concepts, to do a little bit of brainstorming with some content material. So when I developed the curriculum, when I began to bring MLE into the process of interviewing, of making relationships, of everything lifted. They had a sense of, okay, now I can see what's going on. now I can see where it's going. Now I can see what kind of things to do. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. From being almost crippled, from being exposed to the best teaching and learning in counselor education, they were now, and then I began to take it out into the field to practicing counselors. And they liked it. And as a very funny aside, in the academic world, if you want a new program, if you want a new theory to be accepted, you present it at a national conference. So I got on the program of the American Counseling Association to present my mediated learning curriculum for teaching clinical interviewing skills. And I was given a spot on the program. Unfortunately, the spot was on Sunday morning of the last day of the conference at 8 o'clock in the morning. So this program has been presented to the American Counseling Association sometime in the mid-1990s to an audience of 8 people, 6 of whom were my closest colleagues, and 2 were new to it. I didn't pay much attention to it for a number of years. And then, but Reuben and I and the people at the Institute, we were interested in this, and we were out in the world consulting, and we were out in the world working with people in a variety of contexts. So this was always in the back of my mind. In the last 4 or 5 years, as I've been out working with people like yourselves, and we would be talking about what you were doing with your students and your parents and so on, so much of what was coming up was counseling of the students, how to help them focus better, and how to help them be more accepting, and to be ready to do the work of the I'll call it therapy, but the educational therapy as well. And with parents, working with parents on their expectations and the options they have, and how they will relate to their children. So much of what we do, it came to me, is in this area of interpersonal counseling, consulting skills. And since I knew that was one of the things in Professor Feuerstein's long-term vision, I thought, okay, time to go back. So this book is the result of work that I started 25 years ago. And then when I brought it back up, it was so meaningful to me, because I'd learned a lot in 25 years, and leads to this presentation. So this was the article I was talking about in 1990 that laid the groundwork for this, and then the development of the curriculum for training, and then the publication of this book. I brought 4 or 5 copies of it, if any of you want it. Unfortunately, and I feel this is a trade book, and the publishers charge a lot of money for the trade book, and at a 30% discount, it's still $34. And at the end of this first hour or so of our work together, you'll decide whether there's some things in here that you will want to have. But it also has the materials for the second part of the presentation as well. Okay, let's go on. Whoop. What's happening here? Someone come and help me. What did I just do?
Okay. You want to go down to the next one?
Yeah.
Is this where you want to be?
Yeah, this is where I want to be. Yeah. Okay. So, what is the impetus for this presentation, for this information? Well, the first impetus is is there a way of enhancing the understanding of, I put mental health practitioners, but any kind of therapeutic agent, in terms of the foundational processes of behavioral change? How do we create behavioral change? There are many theories about behavioral change. I don't care, and we don't really, from the Feuerstein perspective, we're generic. In other words, you can have a variety of orientations, but the question is, what do we do? What do we say? How do we organize ourselves in order to understand what the dynamics of behavioral change are? And you already have a lot of information about this from the work you're doing. And so in a sense, the kinds of things that I'm sharing with you today should crystallize, coalesce things you already know, and maybe widen and deepen your understanding of how these things happen. And since we have some background in mediated learning experience, how do the parameters of MLE aid us in creating the conditions for behavioral change? Remember that mediated learning experience is not a recipe book. There's nothing in the MLE that says, you must say this, you must do this at this time, you must do this at that time. But rather, they are parameters. And within those parameters, we use the two key words for me throughout all of this is we use our observations. What is it that you see? What is it that's making sense to you? Slowly, over time. And calibration, making small changes. And MLE gives us the roadmap for making those kinds of interventions, formulating responses. So you could think about a three-way process. We observe, we respond, we calibrate. We change the response according to what we see, 4 steps, and then we formulate another response. And we keep this process going over and over again. And one of the beautiful things from the standpoint of MLE parameters is that you know when your client is with you, because your intentionality, what you are going to do, how you're going to convey to the client what you're going to do, when the client gets it, when the client sees it, when the client joins you, and that's reciprocity. And when you've got intentionality and reciprocity going, you know you're off to the races. There are going to be bumps in the road. When there's a bump in the road, you come back. Okay, so the explicative potential of MLE in promoting change, and then the last point I just made, the observations of the providers of MLE needing to address the emotional and motivational aspects, because your clients are coming to you for a specific goal. Might not be their goal, but it's somebody important goal. And part of our job is to draw them into a joining of okay, this goal is worth meeting, and maybe it was your parents' goal, or maybe it was somebody at the school's goal, but look at how much better life would be. And you have skills, you have things you can do. Look what you've just done. So as we move through the process of if we move through the process of formulating our responses, both to the content of the work, the things you're there to teach them, and the process of doing it, what it's like to do it, what you're getting from it, what the interaction feels like, this thing becomes more integral. All right, let me try this again. I think it has to be up there. Yeah, okay. That's what I didn't do the last time. Okay. Now this did not project very well. You may have it in some other of your trainings. But so very quickly, this is Todd Lambert's work. This very quickly, this just shows the relationship of the parameters of mediated learning experience to each other, starting from the center with the universal. the intentionality, reciprocity, meaning, and yeah.
The color.
Okay.
That is that one.
How about that? Now, you can't do this just on Zoom, I'm sorry. In the center, you have the universals. And these are the conditions that we establish. The client needs to know, our client needs to know why we're here, what we're going to do, what our commitment is, and that we're going to stay with them, that we're not going to be blown away by any resistance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You all experience that. And that you're here for a reason. It's going somewhere. Things are going to happen. The things that are going to happen 2 weeks from now are different than right now. It's going somewhere. That's the transcendence part. And then the meaningfulness. It may not be meaningful to our client in the immediacy, but as we start to work, as you see those little sparks of hey, I can do something I didn't think I could do before. And then we get excited about it. We say, oh, yeah, that is so important. I am getting so much pleasure out of the fact that you're doing something now that you couldn't do before. That's the mediation of meaning. Now you'll notice that I'm taking the parameter label, mediation of meaning, and I'm translating it into something that I say, or I do, or I use a facial expression, or some body posture, or whatever. And this is universal. And I don't care whether you're a learning therapist, or you're a Freudian psychoanalyst. The traditional ones sit behind, so they don't want to convey this. But most of our psychotherapeutic and counseling techniques involve conveying this kind of information through what we say or do, or in some cases don't say or don't do. And there are hundreds of anecdotes that flit through my mind about this, and we can talk about this further if you wish. But in any sense, these universals are affected by the direct experience that the learner has with the world. It's a direct experience. You and I are having a direct experience, and I'm conveying things to you that are relevant to the reason we're here, working together, where we're going, that's the transcendence, and why we're going there, that's the meaning. And then the next circle, the next row out, and the reason we do it this way is that you won't get here until you've established this. And early on, and I'll show you the developmental model for it, but early on, most of the work is done here. Most of the mediation is done here. We still have to be doing something, but the mediation is done here. And it's very explicit, very explicit. No, I take that back. It's not necessarily explicit, but it's very much part of our focus. Whether we convey it directly or not is another issue, and I'll come back to that in a bit. And now we have what in the Forstein terminology we call the situational variables. And this is where we are doing the work. Competence, the feeling of competence. You can do this well. Challenge, this is difficult. I'll help you with it. You're able, it's new, it's unfamiliar. But you've done parts of this before. We can do it again. In the lesson plan for IE, comparing and contrasting the current lesson to what you've done before, or in any kind of new presentation of a task that had been mastered previously. Sharing behavior. Tell me how you did that. Okay, when you tell me how you did it, you are formulating in your mind the process. And when you see me going, you're getting feedback that it's that you've done it right, well, or that regulation and control of behavior. I won't say so much about that. So these situational variables, these situational parameters, is the work we're doing and comes out of the work we're doing. And it doesn't happen all the time. That's why we call them situational. Sometimes something comes up in one session, it doesn't come up in another session. But my thesis going forward, I haven't got there yet, is that the client needs to have a readiness to move in this direction. And we know enough about the development of interpersonal relationships from a counseling therapeutic point of view, as well as from just a general interpersonal interaction point of view, to be able to identify the phases of this. Okay, you've all seen this, and I'm not going to spend any real time on it. This is the SOR diagram, and direct exposure experience, mediated experience. The work we're doing is in here, and the outcome of good mediated learning experience is that the learner is more amenable to getting things out of direct experience. One other comment about this, and that is that here's where the observation and the calibration occur. The arrows here say, I want to see how the learner responds to the tasks, the stimulus that they're being presented with. When I see how they are responding, I will then direct mediation toward the learner. After the learner has responded, after the learner has made a response, I need to observe what that response is. Are there limitations in it? Are there things that I missed? Are there aspects that could be expanded? Are there things that I saw today in this session that I didn't see before? Ooh, better do some more of that. Are there things that happened in the other session I didn't see in this session? Okay, how come? So the arrows here are observational, and the arrows here are the formulation of responses. And of course that creates structural cognitive modifiability. In general terms, structural cognitive modifiability means it's now inside me. It's there. It's going to be sustained. I will not need as much or maybe any mediation to perform in these new ways. And the best example of that I can come to is think about the important people in your lives who really influenced you, who are no longer physically available. You haven't seen them in 10 years, 20 years. They may not even be alive anymore, but you do something. You achieve something. You meet a challenge. You discover a competence, and they're there with you. They are still mediating you. The concept of vicarious mediation. And believe me, the older you get, the more you think about and are influenced by the people who mediated you at earlier points in your life. There isn't a day that I don't think about Reuven Feuerstein and the things that I learned from him. So he continues to mediate me. Okay. This is something that I know I've used with, maybe with you, and the last time I did a training here. And it's again something we can go through relatively quickly, and that is that there are 3 partners for transformation. In other words, mediated learning experience and the changes that mediated learning experience creates require changes in the stimuli. Oh, I'm going to see this in a new way. Oh, this has different meaning for me. Oh, I know where to look now that I didn't know where to look before. Changes in the stimuli, in the response to stimuli. It also changes the mediate, and it changes us. It changes the mediator. The parent, the teacher, the sibling, the friend, any concerned activated person who's helping to. And it's a constant interaction. The third grader who gets into the fourth grade and says, this isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. When I was a third grader, I thought all the work in the fourth grade was going to be so hard. And it's not. How come? Or the skills that a person has. One of the reasons I like the framework for the mediated of feelings of competence is that many of our clients can do things, but they don't know they can do them. They don't give themselves the accolade. They don't give themselves and so when a good deal of our mediational responding is to get to feelings of competence. The competence is there. And so we sometimes go back to mediation of meaning, or we go back. But this is. Okay. Now for the integrative part. The structural components of the therapeutic process. Now, I haven't given the attributions for all of this. That's in the book. But it is well known that the developing of an interpersonal relationship occurs in 5 phases. When the client first comes to us, there is an attending phase. The attending phase is this a safe place to be? Are you will be nice to me? Should I really tell you what I'm thinking and feeling? I'm not sure I can. It's all new, it's unfamiliar. And in this attending phase, we are basically creating the conditions for I'll use the word therapeutic relationship. Okay? The attending phase. And it's very important in the attending phase to pay attention to certain dimensions. I'm going to move this up a little bit. Oop. Let me jump for a minute to the focus of the interaction. What's happening in the interaction? Well, every interaction has content and process. Content is the story. It's the details. When you're working on a particular academic skill, you're in content. When the learner is telling you what happened to them in school, when the learner is telling you what happened in school yesterday, that's content. Early in the attending phase, content is a little safer because the learner is not exposing as much of themselves. You're observing. You're observing anxiety. You're observing a variety of behavioral cues. The literature in counselor education warns us not to be too process-oriented in the attending phase. Why? Think about it. Do you really know who it is that you're dealing with? Do you know how they're going to respond? You don't. Not for a while. So the balance of content and process in the attending phase is more on the content. More on the content. But we're always observing. We're always, okay. Then there's the listening phase. After you created conditions of connection, of comfort, of safety, of familiarity, then what we start doing is we start observing what is really going on. What are the themes? What are the patterns? Where does resistance come in? What kinds of things are easier or harder, and how does the person react to it, and so on and so forth. And that's where the observation and the calibration and the really takes place. The content starts to get a little bit closer to process. The learner is a little bit more able to benefit from process, and you can move forward. Then responding. The responding phase is the phase where the relationship is really ready for interaction. You can take risks now that you couldn't take before. You can push the client a bit. You can be more process oriented. You can say, now when you do this, I can see this makes you angry. Let's look at why it makes you angry. When I watched you respond to this task, and I saw that when you got to the bottom of the task, you were really able to handle it. Let's look at why that happened. My favorite example is organization of dots. Where the learner looks at the top of the page and then he looks at the bottom and says, you don't think I can do that, can you? And I say to them, well, actually, I think you will be able to. But you'll be able to when we have worked on the things that are at the top. And you're going to have skills. Now we get to the bottom. Look at the skills you have. Okay, but there's still something you're not seeing. There's still something that needs work. And so this is what happens at the responding and intervening phases. These are the active phases. These are the phases where you've created the climate, the conditions for a safe, comfortable, collaborative relationship, and you're now working. And now here maybe some sharing behavior. Tell me how you did it. I want to know how you did it. Or some focus on individuation. That's an interesting parameter. You did this in a way, you were successful. You solved the problems, but you did it in a very different way. And you've got some really unique ways of doing these things. Will you tell me about it? Or let me observe? Will you let me show you maybe a more efficient way? Client can say yes or no. You may have to present a case for being more efficient. You may have to accept the fact that, you know what? If you had LPAD, one of the LPAD instruments that has always been the hardest for me is the organizer. How many of you have done some LPAD? None of you? Okay, you've done LPAD. The organizer, and it's a series of sentences. It's a series of conditions where you have to pay attention to variables, and you have to you have to put things in a sequential position based on the information you're getting. So it's reading cues, and and that was very hard for me, right from the very beginning. Very difficult for me. I would often, when I was doing an LPAD with somebody, and they were solving the problem, I would say to them very honestly, these problems are hard for me. So as you're doing it, show me how you're doing it. Teach me how to do it, and I wasn't faking it. We have this strategy of being a strategic dummy, but I was being a real dummy. It took me a long time, and I'm still fragile with regard to that. So these are the kinds of things that happen in the responding and intervening phases, and then there's a terminating phase, where you're beginning to say, okay, you've got it. You don't have to work. You're ready to stop. And as an aside, in the counseling and psychotherapy literature, the terminating phase has been neglected. I think it's really important that when this client is ready to stop, maybe not forever, but ready to stop, that you give them the kinds of mediation that helps them to consolidate what they've learned and to be able to move out into the world. And when I was in practice, two things happened. I often had to stop the therapy, because in those years I was going to Israel for a month or two in the summer. And so I would say to them, all right, we're ready to stop. Let's look at what you've accomplished so far. Let's look at, and at the end of the summer, if you still feel like you want to work on some things, we can work on some things. But creating the acceptance of, okay, I've accomplished something. I had a number of instances, and I bet you guys have had too over the years, where you've stopped working with a client because you've gotten to a certain place where they've been successful, and then a year or two later you get a telephone call, as I got. I'm now a freshman in high school, and some of the things that I was working with back when I was in the 7th and 8th grade, 6th or 7th grade, I think I need some refreshers on that. Wonderful, come back, we'll work on it. But terminating and the issues of termination are really, I think, quite important to pay attention to. So, the other thing that, the other aspect that we pay attention to in these phases is the nature of the response. How do we respond? And it seemed to me, from the work we do in MLE, and also my understanding of the wider framework for counseling interventions, is that we have two choices. We can be implicit or explicit. Implicit is indirect and inferred. In other words, I'm getting the feeling like this good person here is getting some understanding of what we're talking about. And I can't see her face, but I can see her eyes, and I can see her. So she's giving me implicit feedback that I'm doing okay. And there was this wonderful experiment many years ago in psychology where they took two people in a big lecture hall. They took 200 people, and the person sitting on this side of the room, every time I turned to look at her, she would go. And then every time I turned to look at her on the other side, she would go. And within minutes, the lecture was going back and forth and back and forth, responding to the implicit cueing of, okay. Now, at the attending phase, content is pretty explicit. And if you don't know the relationship, if you don't know how to read the signals, if you're not comfortable with people, you're not going to be really as amenable, as open to implicit communication. But we have to decide, and that's the calibration part, when to be explicit, directly express, and when to be implicit, and just be kind of infer and and both are important, and they relate to the phases of a developing relationship. So let me summarize the phases of the developing relationship by saying that each of these phases has certain developmental relationship requirements in them. And if we understand them and we calibrate our responses, our observations and responses, we will then be able to create an effective therapeutic interpersonal relationship. Now, let's take this a little farther. This summarizes all right, so now I'm going to summarize. This schema summarizes the things I've been talking about for the last 8 or 10 minutes. Early phases in a relationship, there's a very small overlap between content and process because it depends on building the relationship, sensitive to relationship. Increased focus on content as the client is ready. What do you want to talk about? What do you want to work on? One of the things I love about Todd Lambert's interventions with clients is that he'll start with a client with something that's kind of fun to do, that is non-threatening, that engages the client in a kind of interaction, and then when that happens, you can begin to get into the more salient content, salient to the purpose of the relationship. And the processed interactions tend to be more implicit, but present. Process is implicit. You and I know that we're starting to form a relationship. Okay? We don't talk about it because, come on, it's still a little too new. But I'm going to talk about it as much as I can as I assess your level of comfort. Okay? So that's why these are apart. In the middle phases of a relationship, more dynamic and strategic, initiating and increasing confronting. Confronting is, let's do something that is probably hard for you. Okay? Let's do it. We'll do it together. I'll take your hand. We'll walk through it together. I'm committed to your success. I'm committed that you're gonna know that it's safe enough that I'm not going to do anything that's going to be so stressful for you that you won't be able to do it. But let's take a little risk here. That's what I mean by confronting. And there's more balance between when to be implicit and when to be explicit. See, implicit responding is great because it now becomes internalized. See? She sees how I respond to her, and I'm not saying to you, I really think you understand it, but I'm interacting with you in a way that you feel that there's an understanding, and that's a very important part of a cognitive function, the cognitive function of internalization. You have now an internal picture. Okay, this is a place that's okay to be. This is a place that I'm gonna get something out of. And nobody has said to you, this is the place you're gonna get something out of. But it's implicit in the interaction. And so it tends to bring content and process into some conjunction. And then in the late phases, it's very hard to distinguish content from process. What is content? What is process? Okay, remember, content is the details. If we're talking about the metaphor is music, content are the words, process is the melody. Okay? And interestingly enough, in the early phases, some work will occur here, some work will occur here, but here, most of the work occurs here in the overlapping phases. And more work occurs explicitly by confronting content and process issues. You used to be very frightened of doing this. This used to be very daunting to you. It's not anymore. I'm out of the picture. It's not anymore. Isn't that interesting? What do you think happened? What is it like for you? Those are the kinds of responses that mediate the changes that occur and that reflect the solidifying, the consolidating of the changes. Okay, this is the model that this whole conceptual framework is based on. Mediating social development. And the model is very simple, that when we're mediating social competence, social cognition, there's two parts. There's a knowing part and a doing part. Our learners need to know, have awareness, have social affective awareness, understanding social situations, using cues and information consistently and accurately. Now just turn the page back. It's the kinds of interactions we have with them that lead to this kind of acquisition of skill, acquisition of awareness. And it comes as a consequence of cognitive functions. But it's not enough. We also have to be doing. We have to mediate awareness and skills. That's the doing part. And that means functioning adaptively and flexibly to one's feelings and the demands of the environment. So think about the different parameters of MLE, and when you are working in the content area, how you are also facilitating, to the extent that it's necessary, the social and emotional and affective part. And Professor Feuerstein loved to use the metaphor that was originally coined by Piaget, that cognition is a two-sided coin. There's an intellective side and an affective side. And Professor Feuerstein advanced the metaphor by saying the coin is transparent, and the mediation occurs on the edge of the coin, bringing it together. All right, this is a summary. Integrating the phases and functions in the counseling and psychotherapeutic relationships. We've talked about the developmental phases, and let's read this together. The attending phase, the general goals, is the client presents concerns and we get a feeling for what those concerns are. And the process goals, is what we want to have happen, is that we want the client to get access, get in touch with, become aware of, become familiar with what's going on for them. And we reach it by establishing comfort, and the outcome is awareness. At the listening phase, we're now looking for the meaning. What is it that the client is dealing with? What is it that we need to pay attention to? And that's the finding meaning, and we're basically framing the issue. The child who has difficulty reading because they have difficulty with visual tracking, visual functioning, when we establish that, we have now framed the issue. It's not a reading problem you have, it's a visual functioning problem. And as we work on the visual functioning problem, you become a better reader. And so it's a rediscovery of meaning. It's a changing of meaning. And it becomes recognition. And I am sure you've had the experience that I and the people that I have consulted with have had, and that is when the learner gets to this point, they're with you. They want more, because now you're doing things with them that are making changes for them. In the responding phase, the general goal is clarifying and elaborating meaning. What is it that we are dealing with? It's a reframing. I remember a child who was resisting like crazy doing his homework. And his family was fighting with him about getting work done. And when we diagnosed accurately and started to work with the underlying causes of his reading difficulty, that reframed it. Now it wasn't a question of fighting over the homework, it was how to make the homework meaningful so that he could do it given the new skills he was acquiring. And that's reassessing situations and meaning, and now it's realization. Intervening, action to restructure responses. And this is the process goal is modifying, now making changes, doing things differently. And it's reached by selecting what to pay attention to, focusing on the issues that are, and confronting. We're working on this because this is the area where the problem is. And the outcome is a recalibration. And then terminating, summarizing to reach closure, consolidating, reviewing and reflecting, and separation autonomy. The next two slides give you a kind of a pulling together of the concepts that I've been talking about. How do we make this happen? What is happening? Well, the This one deals with the access to inner process. In other words, how do we help our clients get in touch with, in a meaningful and productive way, with what's going on inside them. It doesn't matter what the content is. Well, it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-step process. First of all, acknowledgement. Is it really there? And then affirmation. It's okay that it's there. It's understandable that it's there. It's meaningful that it's there. If I had these experiences, it would be there for me too. But it's okay for you to have it. It's okay for it to be part of you. Now, when you've got a good attending and listening phase accomplishment, this becomes possible. You don't have to hide from it anymore. You don't have to pretend it isn't there. You don't have to be ashamed of it. It's okay to be there. And then articulation. Let's label it. Let's describe it. What is it that is happening? What is it that you're experiencing? Articulation is really important because it means that now the learner is taking some responsibility for framing and then eventually reframing what it is they're dealing with. And then communication, expressing it, telling someone else about it. Think about the mediational options that we can bring into play to make this possible. And then adaptation, changing it, seeing it differently. And that brings us to to the availability of our inner process. And I must tell you, it's comforting, it's engaging, it opens things up, and so it's an important change process. And this is one of my favorite schemas, the parallel process. And the simple in terms of the phases of the counseling relationship as the work progresses. So these are the phases: attending, listening, responding, interviewing. These are the outcomes. This is what we're trying to do: accessing, framing, reframing, and then acting. And look at think about this as a ladder where the rungs of the ladder are farther apart at the bottom because there's more distance between, get the terminology right, content and process. Content on this side, process on this side. Intention, so our first mediational things are designed to make a connection between content and process, but they're still fairly far apart. And as we go up and we start to mediate regulation and control, competence, sharing, individuation, goals, complexity. And I didn't talk, when I was on the Todd thing, I didn't talk about the last three, which are belief system parameters. And when the learner begins to feel, accept the fact that they can change, when the learner begins to see options that they can take advantage of, optimistic alternatives, you know that you have successfully mediated the situational things, and they are ready for that kind of awareness. And they'll join you in it, but we mediate it. And then as we get farther into the phases of the relationship, there is less distance between content and process. That's what I was showing you in that previous overlap. Now, less distance doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to content and process, but we bring them together in interactions. And all of this relates to formulating responses. Come on. Why is this working? All right, to summarize, so now we're talking about the strategic and tactical levels of bringing MLE into the picture. The strategic level. We want to constantly think about where are we going and why are we going there. And we convey this through our focus on content and our bringing the process into it. And the MLE parameters that set these conditions. Okay? The tactical level, how we will get there. And these are the remaining MLE parameters that guide the therapeutic interventions. And the tactical level is how will we get there? What do we do to get there? Strategy, what do we want to have happen? And that, by the way, that strategy is sometimes comes from the outside and sometimes from the inside. You're going to formulate strategies, and it wouldn't surprise me is in your consultations with you will present, say, you know, the client came for this reason, but it looks to me, based on our initial encounters, that these other things are really quite important, and we need to pay attention to those. So strategy is a developing phenomenon, externally and internally. And sometimes from a counseling point of view, we have to help the parent or the teacher or the outside system reframe their strategy. And we'll get that from our early attending, listening phases, okay? And we move through these parameters according to their situational relevance. Different times, different skills, different readinesses will cause us to mediate in these areas. So think about this as a hypodermic needle. The parameters of MLE are is the thing that we stick into the arm. The modifiability factors is a mixture of what we are developing through our sub-goals, and the mediational interaction is the the pressing the okay, I'm going to go a little bit, I'm going to go faster through this. So this is just another summary of we tend to focus on the dimensions of MLE in the attending phase. Then the listening responding phase, we use the situational ones. In the intervening phase, we hopefully come to the belief system. And then in the terminating phase, we are summarizing and consolidating. Okay. I'm going to now okay. Now, here's what I'd like to do. Maybe let's create 3 groups. I'm going to give you 1, 2, 3, 4 sets of practice vignettes. I've created a very short vignette of something, a therapeutic clinical interaction. Some are with adults. I think there's one with a high school student, etc. And in a group of 4, leaf through these and see which one or two you'd like to work on, because you'll have the vignette. And then you'll have some discussion questions. What's being mediated? What is being mediated? What is the phase of the counseling relationship that you think that this vignette reflects? What is the primary focus? Is it content, process, or maybe both? And where in the vignette did you see it? What did the counselor or the therapist say or do, or not say or do? What was the quality of the response? Was it implicit, explicit, or evidence of both? What else would you like to know about the interaction? Things that come up for you as you think about what took place. And if you have any further observations. And then if you have time, project where in the content and process the sessions might go. What would happen next? What would you want to have happen next? Or what would you think might happen next? And just do some kind of talking about it. Choose the vignette you're interested in. And I'd like to give you maybe, I'll check with you guys in about 25 minutes, see how far you've gotten. And then we'll take the last 10 or 15 minutes to share, see what you came up with. And my goal here is to see whether you can see the relationship of the concepts to what's going on in an interactive setting. Okay? So very quickly get into groups of 4. Now, how should we cue the people who are watching?
I've been chatting with them, so.
Okay.
I took Tanya, she's on her job.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. This is a very interesting part for me because this is the first time I've done this. So I'll be listening for the kinds of insights you have and what you got out of it. And so feel free to be very process oriented with me. In other words, let me know, what you got out of it, things that you needed from it, whether it was useful or not. And it's important for me to know if it wasn't a useful experience for you. The main issue that I'm interested in is the extent to which you can see in these vignettes the content and process issues, the phase, and the way in which the therapist or teacher was responding, implicit or explicit. Okay, and I'll project this. People you're working with are going to see this?
Yeah,
Okay.
I can.
All right, so, and we have about 20 minutes to play with this, so it'll be fairly brief. Okay, which vignette did you guys work with?
We ended up with counseling interaction number 2,
Okay,
high school student. There it is.
okay.
Do you want me to summarize it?
Yeah, just a quick summary.
So he originally comes, it's a high school student, so he comes originally because his mom and his teachers are pushing him to go to college, which
Did any other groups work with this one? Okay, good.
Okay.
So you'll come into this.
They want him to go to college, and he's really not motivated to do that. His school work has been negative for him. But during the course of the session, actually, the focus kind of shifts because the counselor discovers that he doesn't want to go to college, but he is interested in this creative writing class. All right, so, but he's reluctant to, and it kind of shares that he hasn't really written anything for the class to share, but he has done poetry at home. So now the counselor kind of focuses on that and shifts to, okay, well, you just brought it up to me, maybe you'd like to share that with me, so trying to work a little bit of trust in there. And so he does, he brings it in, and then the counselor gives him a feeling of competence by saying, hey, you know what, this is pretty good. Why don't you ask your teacher to share it, or at least to share it with your teacher. Now she doesn't have to share it with the class. So giving that little scaffolding of a step to give it to the teacher, that maybe not be exposed in front of class, because he has this feeling of failure and he doesn't want to do it publicly. But from the rest of this, they're making strategies to, make those steps and to talk to the teacher.
Do you guys want to add anything to that? Things that you saw in that haven't been expressed yet?
Well, I think,
Nice and loud, guys, so we're trying to pick up the mic.
I was just saying, I think Dave did a good job kind of giving the synopsis for that situation. I wanted to kind of touch on the idea that the student hadn't participated in class until recently. And we were kind of talking about how that at that point you might assume a student would just continue to kind of sit down and like not really take any interest at all. So kind of jumping ahead, I guess, maybe to the very last question, what else would you like to know? I think we would like to know a little bit about what sparked his renewed interest in the class, because I think in any normal situation, the student might just let that class go, maybe get an F, withdraw, drop, whatever it might be. So we're kind of interested, like, why has he,
There might have been some quality. There might have been some qualities in that teacher that were not explicitly expressed in the vignette. Something about that teacher who created some sense of competence, or maybe some real mediation of meaning. I see that this is meaningful to you. I can see that even though you haven't been participating, it's it's been meaningful to you.
We also have questions about, what happened in this when this student's passed that has made him reluctant to share. What was the source of that feeling of public failure? So we were kind of interested in that, as well as just the nature of his poetry. That's kind of interesting for us to find out.
what phase of the counseling relationship do you think it was in?
We talked about it mostly responding a little bit into the intervention stage because
Mhm.
they are discussing strategies for him to now, because he has actually shared with the counselor his
Mhm.
poetry, and now they're making strategies to share it with the teacher at least. And then possibly, maybe down the future with the class if he's up for that.
Mm-hmm. Other observations?
In our group, we also kind of noticed that there was a shift from in the sense of what the problem was. Like, was the problem his competence in the actual task of writing or sharing? And we kind of just discovered that it was more about a social sharing issue rather than his actual work, because he was willing to share it with both the teacher and the counselor. So it might just be that social anxiety that needs to be kind of addressed and worked with,
Mm-hmm.
more than the competence in the task itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So my group did this vignette as
What
well.
about content process? What did you see happening in content process? Were you able to discern?
Oh, at the beginning, mostly content, just trying to figure out what's the source here. But that becomes a little more process. They really do start to talk about what can you do? Let's bring it in. What are strategies now for talking to your teacher?
Mm-hmm.
So the process kind of begins pretty quickly, actually, once he discovers that this is what we're going to focus on.
But you identified a phase that you thought the relationship was in.
Yeah.
And that phase may be more amenable to bringing process in. And a lot of things happen before. If it's a classroom, you can assume that he at least he's read this teacher. He's been sitting in class. He hasn't been brought in any work. And when the teacher approaches him not in a negative sense, but in a sense of you haven't turned in any work. Tell me about it. And when he conveys that he has done some writing, but he's never shown it to anybody, there's an implicit assumption there about mediating feelings of competence and mediating individuation. If I read your poetry and I get something from it, that can convey to you, the writer, that there must be some value in it. And I may or may not make a big deal about it. Oh, this is wonderful, this is wonderful. In fact, there's some evidence in the psychological field that implicit communication is actually taken in better than highly effusive. That seems fake. That seems put on.
Hey, Lou.
Any observations from?
Hey, Lou. Lou. Hello.
Mm-hmm.
What was the problem?
Lou.
I also thought it was interesting that there's a mediation for alternatives. Because it seems like in this client, it's a very dichotomous view. Either he turns in his homework and it's showed to the entire class and he has to be ridiculed or embarrassed or whatever, or he turns in nothing at all. And so the counselor kind of steps in and says, well, there's this other alternative where you could talk to your teacher and say, hey, I'm embarrassed about sharing it in front of the class. Can I just give you the assignment?
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting and important observation. And that's, mediating options, and to me, the issue of being ready to consider optimistic alternatives is that you have to have some sense of confidence. You have to have some sense of that you've done something, that it's that's meaningful. Okay. Any other observations? Now, my process question is, by looking at this from the standpoint of content or process, of phase, of the nature of the response, does this help focus on what is going on? Are these kind of explicatory concepts helpful in looking at a piece of
Yeah, I think it helps break down the process so we can kind of understand why was this counselor successful? So we can now be mindful of what was that counselor's process for making this student feel like, okay, I can do this.
Could you see yourselves taking a piece of your work with a client and analyzing it in the same way, looking back at it and say, okay, what did I say or do? What did I want to have happen? What was it that I was doing? Should I do more of it or less of it? Where am I going with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of as we were like learning and applying it to the situation, it got me thinking about my students and like what phase am I in with my students and like how much can I push them, where like what is our level of comfort. And it's got me thinking of like, okay, with this student who might be fairly new, I might still be in like the attending or listening phase. So focusing, like it changes how I think, okay, like how I want to structure my session, the things I want to say, and then like how much I want to push them or like how I want to mediate them.
Okay, interesting. Okay, what vignette did you guys work on?
We did number 4.
Okay. Give us a little background on that. I'll project it.
So there's an adult female who is working on issues. So she is, I'm just going to read this. So come to work on issues of her inability to find or sustain satisfying dating and male relationships. And she says that she finds herself attracted to men who are unavailable, they're married, they have a fear of commitment, they're emotionally closed off, and she can't seem to figure out why she's doing it. And so then over the course of this, the counselor digs a little bit deeper and then a little bit deeper again. So first he has her access the details of the repeated failed relationships. And then he asks her to start thinking about her past history of relationships, jobs, school experiences, other things in her life.
Okay. So how did you analyze it in relation to the concepts?
Well, we thought that in kind of over the course of this, they go from that responding, they're definitely in that active phase, so they go from responding where, the counselor is able to push her to think a little bit deeper about her issues, and then into the intervening where there's that sharing, they're in like the nitty gritty, and they're doing like the real work, the real process of it. And it actually turns out her parents divorced, and it comes down to her relationship with her father. And then she's able to link that to the other relationships that she has with men.
Okay, so what did you think was being mediated?
Okay. Well, we felt like it was kind of she's here to work to figure out why she's making these decisions and why she keeps taking the same actions even though she's not successful. Obviously, her strategies are not working for her. And so he's mediating to figure out, to help her figure out why, and then find an alternative once she knows more and knows better.
Agree? Want to add anything?
Yeah.
You talked about the phase, and the cue is good. If the counselor or the therapist is starting to make really suggestions and so on and confront, then it has to be in more of the responding, intervening phase. Responding is a little more passive. In other words, this is what I'm hearing. This is what I think is happening here. So that's the reframing part, and then that's the framing part. This is what I'm hearing. This is what I think is going on. And when you're saying and doing this, you're looking for cues. You're looking for the client to say, yeah, this makes sense. Or you encourage them to say, well, it's not quite this. It's really maybe a little bit of that. And so you kind of work toward a good framing. And then when you start to get more active in the intervening phase, you are now starting to reframe things. Reframing means you give it a new meaning. You give it a different meaning. And it's not just us as the therapist who gives it the new meaning. The new meaning is arrived at jointly. It's arrived at collaboratively. Do you think that happened there? What is it in the vignette that makes you think it happened, either implicitly or explicitly?
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think the point where she starts to realize, like reflecting back and saying, okay, well, when I was 8 or 9, my parents got divorced, and so that was at the point that she's starting to like name, picking out a situation where she can make that connection.
Okay. Jump in with any observations you have about this or questions you have about this. In this vignette, was it primarily content or process or a mixture of both? And if you say a mixture of both, you need to identify which was which.
I feel like it introduces the situation with the content, but it's mostly process because it starts talking about what the counselor is doing, how he's encouraging her to reflect on certain things. So I feel like the content is just kind of the introduction of the situation, but it's mostly process.
Okay. And say something?
No, I was agreeing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mostly process.
Yeah.
But my thinking about this, my reflecting on this, is that content never leaves the field. It just becomes more implicit. We're talking about, we're dealing with the interaction, but it's kind of like always there is this content that we're reflecting on. And in a more detailed explication of a therapeutic interaction, we might want to say to the client, we're working on it in this way because of what happened then. Can you bring it up? I remember a client, actually I think it was probably the client that I used as a model for this, who eventually at the end of a therapy, toward termination, in fact the clue for me for termination was that she was able to say, this person who I was mad at in my family is really not the person I was mad at. And that now I can see it. And I think now I'm ready to work on it. And then we had to say, okay, are you ready to work on it now, or do you want to let it percolate for a while? That's another concept I like, another descriptive concept I like in this interpersonal area, and that's percolation. Give it time to, after you put the ingredients in, you put the water in, you put the coffee in, and you let it percolate, and some new things come out. Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to know about the interaction as you read it?
Yeah, we were thinking about the timeline, and I know this it's different for every student, it's different for every person, but how long would it take them to get from the content to the process? After they've started the process, how long does it take her to, start to think about these surface level observations and then get to the real root of the problem?
You can't answer that,
Yeah.
but you can think about it. In my view, you're reading the client's signals. You're moving forward, but you're moving forward with an awareness of the client's readiness to acknowledge and to tolerate what they now know, the steps, to accessing, and those are experiences. It's one thing to say it's okay for it to be there, but how do you get to the point where it's okay to be there? You share it with somebody, they hear it, they understand it, they accept it, they give you feedback about, you know, it was courageous of you to get there, and you know, you're saying it in a very meaningful way, and I understand it. And if you've done good attending and listening, the I understand it becomes very meaningful, because now you're in a shared relationship. So there is a progression. It's hard to predict how much time it will take. It sometimes goes very rapidly, and sometimes you got to go back. Sometimes a new piece of understanding, of insight, of experience comes up, and you go back. In therapy, dreams and recollections often open up things that, you know, that happened before that you hadn't thought about, that weren't meaningful, but now they are, because you're accessing it. And I think, you know, when the client says, "Okay, I'm looking at this in relation to, you know, the experience I had with my parents and how they got, you know, they separated and got divorced, and maybe it's trust issues and so on and so forth." So you can't predict time, and sometimes things will go. Oh, there's another thing that I haven't included in this model, but you'll go forward, and then there's a plateauing, a time for kind of getting used to it. The new insights are fragile, and they need some time to settle in. So, you know, you're moving up, and then there's a plateau stage, and it's important that we don't think the plateau stage is the end, but we watch what's going on in the plateau stage for the next readiness to go further. And by the way, I think that's quite analogous to academic therapy. You know, okay? Okay, any other observations or comments you want to make about the work you did on this? Okay. Everybody's going to get get this. Okay. So let me just finish my part, you know, my part of this by showing you what else is on this that you're going to get, and how you might want to think about using it. Okay. I'm going to show you 3 things, just show them to you, and then you'll have them in hand, that came out of the curriculum, out of the teaching curriculum that I developed. Formulating the counseling responses using an MLE model for summarization. In other words, if you were in the attending phase, what was the content you were doing, you were focusing on? What was the process? Were you being implicit or explicit? And you can maybe check these off, or you can look at what you've done from this standpoint, and then what response would you make? What did you want to have happen? So this is a worksheet that has the phases, the 4 phases. And then here is another worksheet that I've prepared that whoop. Come on. Why does it keep going back? Help. Okay, yeah. And here's formulating counseling responses, integrating MLE. So if you review a tape of what you've done, a video recording of what you've done, identify as many counseling behaviors that came up in your interaction. And you won't fill in every frame, because everything doesn't happen in every interaction. But did you see yourself mediating regulation and control of behavior, for example? Well, if you did, what did you do and say that mediated regulation and control of behavior? What did you want to have happen? Intended outcome. And then, what was content? What was process? What phase were you in? Now, I follow this up. The last thing I'll show you is a compilation I made from the students I worked with. So an example of intentionality reciprocity. What does the counselor do? Sits forward, asks the client's view of the brother's power. What did they want to have happen? Showing interest, clarifying meaning. Was it content or process? Was it implicit or explicit? And what phase was it in? So this sheet shows how you take the things that we've been talking about and what it looks like in an active way. I'm going to be working with a university in South Africa that are working with marginal students, because in South Africa, as a consequence of the end of apartheid, the government opened up lots of places in universities for students. And they came, but because they came out of the townships and they came out of the apartheid education, they didn't have skills. They didn't have study skills. They didn't have motivation. They didn't have a sense of why they were there. They were there, and so this particular university has brought mediated learning experience, i.e., into it, and working with the system of the university to create programs for to help marginal students. And so one of the things that we're talking about with my colleague is taking worksheets like this and adapting them so that a counselor or a learning therapist or a faculty member, they got wonderful buy-in from a couple of the faculties to work with these students, can look at what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, and what its effect is. And I think that's what we all do. And my motivation and interest in presenting this to you is to further enhance your ability to make the interpersonal interaction that occurs with your students around the skills, around the tasks, and the significant others in their lives, their parents, their teachers, the other professionals, to make the outcomes meaningful for the students you're working with. Thank you for the chance to work with you like this. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.